Today, we are going to talk about how one neuron communicates to another neuron. The last video that I posted involved how a message is communicated across a single neuron. A neuron is the individual building block of the cell, of the nervous system. And to review, you can go back and watch that video of these different parts and their function and how communication happens. So we left off where, if you look at this individual neuron, how at the axon terminal, once an action potential reaches there, chemicals are released into a gap called the synapse and dropped onto the dendrite surface of the following neuron. So that's how communication happens between two neurons. So if you, on the right here is a picture of actual what it looks like for chemicals to be released from those axon terminals. So you have here on the left, the action potential reaches those axon terminals, pushes these bags of chemicals to the very end of the surface of the axon terminals, where the encasement of those chemicals merges with the end of the cell and the contents are released into the gap. Once they're released into the gap, they float down and land on the dendrite surface of another cell, send a message. It would maybe do a chemical bond, and that sends a message, stimulation for the next cell, and then it gets released. So another way to think about that, if you can see in this picture, there's a black circle here. And you can see here's, again, the dendrites of this cell, the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminals here. What you're going to see is that this picture is going to blow up that little circle. So you have the axon terminal here, and the dendrite surface of the following cell underneath it. When the action potential eventually reaches those axon terminals, that positive charge is going to force these little bags, and these bags, and you can see that it's pointed to here, called vesicles. Those are the bags of chemicals. The positive charge is going to force those vesicle membranes to merge with the porous end of those axon terminals, and that will force the release of the contents, those neurotransmitters, into the gap between the axon terminals and the dendrite of the following cell. So this is that same picture once that neural impulse or the action potential reaches the axon terminal. You can see those bags of chemicals called vesicles get pushed to the end. They release their contents through the porous membrane of the axon terminal. They get released, and now they've made these neurotransmitters look like they're shaped like Legos. They're three-dimensional, so they're not just a square. But if they match molecularly the shape of the dendrite receptors, they're going to form a chemical bond and send a stimulation message to that following cell. And then those neurotransmitters are going to get released and sucked back up into the axon terminal where they get reused, because our bodies are really efficient recycling machines. So this is a lot to take in, I'm sure. I wish I could take questions in this video, but obviously I can't. Let's see what else I would want to say about this. I want to say a little bit more about neurotransmitters and reuptake. So the neurotransmitters are the chemicals that do the basic communication. Reuptake is the sucking up. Once those neurotransmitters come down and attach to the receptors on the dendrite, they do get released. And then in the normal process of communication, they get pulled back in or vacuumed back up into that axon terminal where they get repackaged into vesicles and reused again. That process is called reuptake, that vacuuming up of those neurotransmitters. This is just kind of a picture of what the actual three-dimensional molecular shape of these neurotransmitters can look like. And this is probably going to be pretty much the last slide for this particular talk, but I have quite a bit to say about this. There are different types of neurotransmitters, and I'd like you to be familiar with the kind of the jobs that they do. The first one is a big word called acetylcholine, and that is a chemical that gets released that is responsible for our muscle movements, all our muscle, and also it's critical in our formation and storage of memories. For our muscle movements, basically those are the neurotransmitters that get released, and if they get blocked, our muscle movements can get blocked. And actually, there was a drug that was used in battle in South America that was discovered that was derived from a plant and that drug was called curare. What was discovered was that the molecularly what happened was discovered later on. If a person got injected with an arrow or a dart that had this plant-derived drug in it, this curare, that curare got into the bloodstream, and then the chemical shape of that blocked up or plugged up the holes of the receptors for acetylcholine. So if you have that going on, acetylcholine can't do its job when it's being released. So a person would then basically have all their muscle functions cease. So you can imagine if you get shot with this, basically your legs give out, you just fall around. You can't blink because that's a muscle, but you could think about other important muscles that you need, like your heart to pump your blood throughout your body, your diaphragm to pull air into your lungs and expel it out. Yeah, basically, if a person gets injected with this, they live a short and painful death where they're just frozen. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter responsible for all of our movements. Dopamine is another critical neurotransmitter. This is responsible for the feelings of pleasure. So there's even a whole set of neurons that course through the middle of the brain called the pleasure pathway. And so anything that brings you pleasure, whether it's listening to a good song, sex, good food, watching a TV show, anything, getting a text from your best friend, all that's going to release dopamine, and it's going to make you want to do that again. So there are different types of drugs a person can take which affect these neurotransmitters. Some of those drugs are called antagonists. So you can think if someone's being antagonistic, they're against you. That means they work against the effectiveness of these neurotransmitters. But some are called agonists, which is that actually promotes and helps the effectiveness of these neurotransmitters. Cocaine is a drug that is an agonist of dopamine. So if a person takes cocaine, that shuts down the reuptake process of dopamine. So when that happens, you get dopamine being released into the synapse, grabbed by the dendrite, the following cell sends a message, and then normally that dopamine molecule would be pulled back up into the axon terminal of the other cell. It can't do that if reuptake is shut down. So it goes down and stimulates again, gets released, comes down and does it again. So some drugs work in that way by shutting down reuptake. And cocaine is one drug that does that with dopamine. And because dopamine is associated with pleasure, it's a highly addictive drug, obviously. Also, dopamine is involved in movement. Part of the brain called the basal ganglia relies on dopamine for us to move our bodies, like across a room or to get up or to stand up and start walking. If you've ever heard of Parkinson's disease, you have a degeneration of cells that operate using dopamine, and you're going to have all sorts of muscle problems. You may see a person shaking. A lot of times a person with this Parkinson's disorder will have a hard time starting a new movement because basically they're lacking the dopamine and the cells that produce it because those cells wither and die. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's critical. Most antidepressant drugs work with serotonin. So the research evidence is thought has been for severe depression, you're not having enough serotonin basically being released into the synapse. And so drugs like Prozac will shut down reuptake for serotonin. And so serotonin gets to stay in the synapse and do its job over and over again, eventually, hopefully, relieving depressive symptoms. Also, a person who takes Molly, MDMA, ecstasy, all sorts of name for it, that forces a release of a lot of serotonin, and a person will feel euphoria and just a heightened sense of just like being on top of the world. Another neurotransmitter, endorphins, and I have these pictures up here on this slide for a reason. Morphine is a drug that obviously blocks pain. Some people may have had that before in a medical procedure. But we have natural neurotransmitters in our body that have the same molecular shape as morphine. They're called endorphins. So if you've ever had a runner's high and you start to run, it's like, oh, this is painful, this is hard, but you get going, endorphins start to rush through our body and it blocks some pain messages. Another thing, you may know someone who's like been really intense in a basketball game or a soccer game, and they may have really injured their ankle or something, but they don't feel it because endorphins are flowing through their body and blocking pain messages from making it to the brain. But as soon as they stop, the game's over, all that stuff, the endorphin release stops and they feel all the pain. A recent one that was discovered, a neurotransmitter that gets released, is called anandamide, and it's involved in pain relief, stimulates eating, and it can sometimes interfere with memory. I'm going to post a video about this particular neurotransmitter. And obviously the drug that mimics it is THC. So if a person smokes weed, they are basically stimulating their own anandamide receptors. Again, it's why medical marijuana is what it is. It generates pain relief, stimulates eating for people who are having cancer treatments and are losing their appetite. The memory part is kind of a problem, though, for people trying to remember things. So we have natural occurring neurotransmitters, the molecular shape of which is mimicked by THC. GABA is the last of the neurotransmitters I want to talk about. These are natural occurring chemical messages in our nervous system that are responsible for relieving anxiety. And so one drug that actually facilitates the release of GABA is alcohol. So if a person drinks alcohol, they get more release of GABA neurotransmitters, and that causes them to be more relaxed and just less anxious. But taken in large quantities, obviously, that can be a problem because that inhibits or gets in the way of acetylcholine, which you can see here. If you inhibit acetylcholine, you're going to have problems moving around a room and remembering what you did later on. That's what happens when a person gets really drunk. They basically have so much GABA being released, they lose coordination and they don't remember what they did the next day. So those are the different types of neurotransmitters I would like you to be familiar with. My next talk will be about parts of the brain and nervous system and how they're studied.